listening to the Coalmine Canary. Warning: side effects may cause cognitive dissonance.
Is another deep dive investigation. If you watched any of the Bernie Sanders 17 million Chinese bank account allegation deep dive videos, Nick Shirley's, the meme is supposedly a total fiction, made up. But whenever the internet says in response to some kind of shocking allegation like that, and the internet tries to say, well, it's all just made up. Could it all be made up? Yeah. But could Nick Shirley, based on his history of fraud investigations, have discovered something? Yes. So we investigated it. And this is another one. This is not about Bernie Sanders. This is about Barack Obama. And Tulsi Gabbard, the Trump administration, and apparently dating all the way back to 2020, I think, there was an investigation and some kind of report, and it all related back to Barack Obama being the spearhead of something very treasonous. And Tulsi Gabbard came out with it recently. I believe it was earlier this year, 2026. Supposedly she was outgoing and she left the administration due to some illness with her husband. And one of the last things that they declassified was this investigation into Barack Obama. A lot of people have been saying basically since 2020, a little or shortly thereafter, that Barack Obama has been running a shadow government behind Joe Biden and never really left office. He's been running the country ever since he was in office. And basically, the person running the country behind Joe Biden. And so, that opens up questions. Well, how, who, what, when, why, how did it begin? And then we also have to look at the recent influx of numerous DSA, Democrat Socialist of America, candidates shockingly winning elections in their districts. They're already outed as manipulating, and Chinese are remotely manipulating voting machines related to Dominion and the whatever. What are the name of those machines? But I think they start with an S. But anyway, that's it. So we know that they have been using elections. They're frauding elections. Okay. The mail-in ballot scams. There's so much. I mean, it's like every aspect of our lives have been touched by this shadow government. Well, where did it begin? How did it begin? And it goes back to actual Obama and fake documents and fake IDs, fake backgrounds. This is all part of the Tulsi Gabbard declassification or investigation, whatever Tulsi Gabbard released right before she left, and the press release that she gave, not a press release, but the press briefing that she gave, public. And so where did it all begin? How did it all begin? How did it evolve? Well, we have to go back a little bit of history. So we're going to start here. And, if you looked at the Bernie Sanders one, I did basically a live question Q&A with Google Gemini. And at the beginning of that video, about 3 minutes in, I thought I lost everything that I had, the whole transcript and of the conversation that I had before I started videotaping. And so in this one, I saved it. I saved it separately as a document, and this is how it went. So I asked, the first question was, and something that Obama was pretty famous for, was influencing a new education standard, and is called Every Child Succeeds Act. Well, that, at the time, no, at the time it sounded so great. Every child succeeds. Yes, that's what we all want. It sounded so great, and there was so much pushback against Common Core, and people thought that Common Core was harming education. And education funding was falling short of needs. But now we can look back, full 2020, rose-colored glasses off. First black person to become president, and all this kind of stuff. And, get the rose-colored glasses off of that, because the toxicity from the racist toxicity, the reverse racism, the anti-white racism that began and continues out of the mouth of Michelle Obama since those days, is absolutely beyond reasonable, okay, and irrational, and paints pictures that are complete fictions, okay. A lot of this has come out and been, we're going to pause this for a sec. One sec. I'll be right back. All right. Sorry about that. So we're back. And so the point is that it's very telling that when you look up about Kenya, Ilhan Omar, in I think it was the second or third video from the Bernie Sanders series. When you look up Kenya and USAID, Kenya, how they moved to Kenya, how they moved Ilhan Omar and her colonel father, who was in charge of education in a scientific socialist movement and government in Somalia. He came over to America, okay? And when you realize that President Obama's father, aunts, supposedly that side of his family were all from Kenya, then you begin to realize something. And now with what happened with Tulsi Gabbard's release, and media and press briefing and everything, you start to get a very dark picture. You're starting to see through the fog a little bit. This title of the act, Every Student Succeeds, often called the Every Child Succeeds Act, was signed into law by President Barack Obama December 10, 2015. It replaced the earlier No Child Left Behind Act and updated the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Now, without going too deep, 1985, President Reagan had an education committee. Charlotte Iserbyt was his education secretary of education at the time. And Senate committee came out with a document called A Nation at Risk. We were the number one education country. We were the number one in basically every education statistics in the world, internationally at that time. And then after Reagan, we had Father Bush, and then we had Son Bush come later, and he's the one who brought in Common Core. Now, Common Core still exists today, and people still follow it. So to say that every Student Succeeds Act replaced it, I mean, schools and states still follow Common Core standards. But my point is, it's ironic, and what I want you to see is ironic that a report comes out. We were the number one that said when we were the best education system in the world. A report comes out and says we were a nation at risk. And then all of a sudden, ever since that report came out, America has fallen behind farther and farther and farther and farther. And since COVID, it's absolutely ridiculous how pathetic the education product has been. It's abysmal. And every year, everybody's like, well, in higher education, they talk about the product coming out from K-12 because they have to create, colleges and universities have to create new sections for students that don't even meet the requirement, that don't come close to meeting the requirements of entering into college. They have to create, instead of level 100 classes, they have to create level 0 classes. And basically have to enroll them in a community college level so that they can finish the standards they need in order to actually begin a 4-year college degree. Well, all of that costs a lot of money, okay, and a lot of funding and taxpayer and dollars. And this has been going on for decades and decades, basically ever since Obama came into office. And here's why. Every Child Succeeds Act. And essentially, they got rid of the Common Core standards. They replaced the Common Core standards that you actually had to pass testing and so forth and so on in order to advance. And, testing, everything just changed. I'm just going to say that so I don't have to dive too deep into it. Everything changed, okay? And it changed in a way that removed barriers for people of color, non-English speaking people, immigrants. And you can see why that's important later on when Biden comes into office. So it was all a setup. It was all pre-planned. And when it came into being, schools got billions of dollars of funding. And as long as they did certain things, they would get the funding. As long as they did certain things that Barack Obama administration wanted related to the color of your skin and lowering standards so that more people of color could pass. This is what is so deceptive about every Student Succeeds Act. It isn't like we're going to put the bar up here and we're going to make sure that everybody gets to that bar and then they're going to succeed. No. We're going to remove the bar because that is racism and white supremacy. And then everybody can pass without a barrier. And that's what changed. That was the whole point of every Student Succeeds Act. And it's a very deceptive, it's called doublespeak. You say something that everybody's going to accept as positive, and the truth is you are doing something very manipulative and evil with it. It actually means something completely different. And at the time, I don't think anybody in America realized, because we all had rose-colored glasses on, I don't think anybody realized what every Student Succeeds Act meant and was intended to be. All right, we're going to get back to being the best country in the world in education. Our kids are going to be amazing and they're going to all get these degrees. And no, what happened was it destroyed everything. Because when these kids got passed through K-12 and they couldn't read beyond third, fourth, fifth grade level in high school, well, then they flooded the college market with all of these underdeveloped, underprepared, uneducated, incapable students. They had to put them in remedial level, pre-bachelor level courses in order to get them so they could just enter the first year of actual college, freshman year, so they could be ready to enter into a freshman year college level course on a college university at that time. So, and I know this because I was in a doctoral of education program, and my mentor, I was a graduate assistant for the provost of a university. And because of that experience and seeing the inner workings of the ivory tower and all the things that they had to deal with, and having all that vicarious, I learned it vicariously. I wasn't the provost, but I was a graduate assistant, and so I was there for pretty much everything. And so I learned a lot in those years, and that was about 8 years of my life. So what happened then is you have this massive weight that you just put on a ship sailing across the ocean. I mean, more weight than it's supposed to carry. And so what is designed to carry. And so universities had to make decisions, and they had to hire professors and adjuncts and everything else, and to meet the demand of this influx from K-12 of students who were really not prepared to enter college at all. However, because of Every Student Succeeds Act, it had to be done. And so what do you think that does to college degrees? Well, if they all have to succeed in order for you to get federal millions and millions of dollars of federal funding, which you need in order to survive and for programs to continue existing in higher education on the college campuses, and then also to create certain types of new courses, social justice, all these kind of race-related things. These are when it all began cropping up. Kind of like how land grant acts worked to states in order to form state universities. Michigan State, Indiana State, Utah State, all the state universities began with land grant acts, okay, long ago. This was the same kind of thing, Every Student Succeeds Act. Well, you sort of got these funds if you did and created certain kinds of programs, gender studies, all these kind of things began to creep up after this happened. And at the time, we had no idea that that was happening. It was not published in the media to everybody. Okay. But that's not the only time he did that. Okay. We're going to keep going on here. And I'm sorry to deep dive like that and go on into that, but that sets the foundation for a shift in the type of education that students were going to begin receiving, and the types of programs that were going to get funded and opened up on college universities. So there was going to be a shift. This was, and the reason I brought up Ilhan Omar and her dad and scientific socialism, because that's essentially what was ushered in. And they say her father was a taxi driver. Maybe he had a taxi. Maybe that was his sort of alter ego life. But I believe that he had a lot more influence on his Kenya peer than was ever disclosed. I don't know if that's true. It's complete conjecture. You can call it conspiracy theory. But they both came from Kenya. Obama was much older than Ilhan Omar, but Her father wasn't. So whether they're contemporaries or not, I don't know. Whether that could be associated somehow, I don't know. However, scientific socialism and what we have as a product now, 10, 15 years later in America, this is where it all began. Okay? And it was an intentional act to transform America and to start breeding socialism, scientific socialism, atheist-based, atheistic belief systems, which has led to the corruption of everything godly left in America. Okay. Anyway, key facts about the law. It was ushered in 2015. So, and you can look back and you can begin to associate when all of these kind of children began to change and the thinking began to change in mass. And I don't mean just here and there. No, I mean in mass, and programs began to crop up and in colleges and universities, and students began to graduate with these social engineering degrees related to this transformation about gender and sexuality and social justice and the rewriting the history of the United States, white supremacy. All of this began at this point in time. At this point in time. All right, so AI offers what changed from blah blah blah, how state testing works now. See right there. Oh, I didn't even read that far yet. So when I said that they removed the barriers of state testing, you're no longer judged by your performance any longer on if you can pass or not. You're literally judged on the color of your skin. And you can say whatever you want. However, I have my own teaching experience in Title I schools, and the unwritten policies are pass them no matter what. Do not give them anything less than a C. It doesn't matter if they do not turn anything in at all. And if you do, they're going to brand you a racist. They're going to brand you as somebody who can't control their classroom. You cannot punish them. You cannot say anything to them. You cannot even write them up in the behavior system that schools often offer teachers. And if you say anything bad about their children, then the parents will threaten your life. I know, because I had that happen. They'll threaten your career, your reputation, get you fired. It's insane. It's insane what teachers go through, especially in Title I schools. And if you don't know what Title I is, that's low income. That's like 97% free lunches, and the taxpayers funding all of this, and they're all getting You're funding literally what Charlotte Iserby said back in 1985, the dumbing down of America. And it's like a nation at risk wasn't an alarm bell for us to improve. No, a nation at risk was doublespeak as well, so that America would and Common Core would reduce barriers for people of color. And DEI and all of this came in next after that. It wasn't doing a good job. The problem is people's children were not being educated at the level that their parents were. And people were having a lot of problem with that. When you come out and your child can barely read and your child can barely write with good grammar and in a way that conveys actual meaning, people are going to get upset. And that's what happened with Common Core. But now it's worse. It's a billion times worse. It's so off track because there are no standards. There's no the state testing is not tied to funding anymore, or I don't know. Don't quote me on that statement. I may be misstating what I'm intentionally trying to say, but I'm not going to go any deeper on that. Everything changed. The barriers were removed, and it was all because of skin color. It wasn't a way to challenge people to be better. You know, before Lyndon B. Johnson instituted all the welfare acts and all of those kind of things, okay? And all of that was ushered in. People of color in America were on the same footing and same ground as white counterparts. And you can say whatever you want about the time period. But once those welfare acts were instituted in America, and everything for people of color changed dramatically. And now today, that social engineering experiment, which there's a lot to it. There's a lot to it. It's very there's a lot of spirituality to it. It's very deep and it's very dark. And it's a failed experiment. Let's just leave it at that. It's failed. And even the black community has fatigue over, they call it chimp out now. Chimping out. You know, that used to be the most racist, nasty thing you could say next to the N-word about a black person. You know, I don't mean the N-word like in a rap song and what's up, mate? You know, they used to do that in Oklahoma while I was living in Oklahoma. I mean, I had this friend, he was a Hispanic guy, and they were all Hispanic, and that's how they would talk to me because they were from California, and that's how they all talk to each other. And I'm white, and they talk to me that way. I talk to them that way. We all just hung out like that. But then all of a sudden it became like the worst thing in the world, and became once all this Obama stuff came in, and people said it back then, and I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. You know, he was dividing everybody by race and all this kind of stuff. Well, actually, he was 100%. That's exactly what he did. And that's what the phrase, every student succeeds act. Every student, except white people, because they were already in the mind of Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, and what became the Democrats from that point forward, with all the white supremacy and DEI and all this kind of stuff, equity instead of equality. Equity is supposed to replace equality in the United States Constitution. This is the war that's been going on ever since. Obama began a war in America. And you could call it a race war, but it's worse than that. It is a psychological warfare, and it's backed by China, Chinese dollars, and whether it's the actual state of China or whether it's, you know, criminals in their country, just like we have criminals in our country, it's backed by cartels. It's backed by everybody who wants to destroy America. All of America's foreign enemies backed exactly what Barack Obama instituted, the scientific socialism. And it goes all the way back to Somalia, and where Barack Obama actually came from, and who raised Barack Obama, who made a pathway for Barack Obama to go to Harvard, and Michelle Obama, and their backgrounds, and their supposed degrees, and their status and stature. I 100% believe that it's all a fantasy. Just from doing these deep dives already, and just what I know of politics and espionage and you know, covert ops, black ops, counterintelligence, all this kind of stuff that's been going on in the United States for a very long time. When you study those kind of histories in the United States, then you get a pretty clear picture of the processes that are used to prop up certain things. And we do it in foreign countries, and then we import it to the United States. We train them in foreign countries, we import them to the United States. And if you don't understand that's what happened with the open borders, then you're blind to it. You're ignorant of it. You have no knowledge in order to think anything else. And it's depressing, but that so many people are ignorant of these things. But it's by design. Okay, they're literally taught into this trash fantasy, scientific socialist, Lenin Marxist, oppositional defiant, sociopathic, narcissistic, dark triad cluster, personality disorders. They're literally educated into it, and this is where it came from, right here. Every child succeeds act. Every student succeeds act. This is where it began. Every student except whites, because whites were already the supreme in the country. And that's exactly the dogma that they began to preach from the pulpit of the White House. Was that white people had too much of the cake for too long, and the Democrats are the one who ushered in the decline of the Black community in America. It wasn't the Constitution. It goes, you can trace it directly and exactly to Lyndon B. Johnson and the welfare acts that they instituted during his presidency. Immediately after, it was Lyndon B. Johnson who took over after JFK, right? Immediately after, they assassinated John F. Kennedy. And he outed it back then. There was a shadow government. Well, I'm going to tell you right now that the God that they wanted and created to sit in that seat of power was Barack Obama. The literal visage and image of everything that they wanted to prop up in this country was created and instituted to be Barack Obama in his life. And I believe it began when USAID pulled out of Somalia and went to Kenya with all of their resources. And the U.S. military came back home after Clinton brought them home, and we left Mogadishu and all that kind of stuff. They trained everybody in scientific socialism. They trained Barack Obama in scientific socialism in Kenya, gave him all this other kind of life, and I believe it's all fake. And then that's exactly what he went to Harvard and learned all of everything that he did, was a homosexual. I'm not saying he was a homosexual. I'm not saying he's a homosexual. I'm saying that that's part of the publicity, and that's part of the people trying to, and everybody's called it conspiracy theory and all this kind of stuff. And, a lot of stuff's come out, okay, over the years about Barack Obama and Michelle Obama. I mean, Hollywood outed it. Joan Rivers outed it. I'm just saying it's all out there that this could be, right? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying it could be. And what I'm saying is it all fits. The puzzle pieces fit. And my whole point is okay, these investigations, I'm just asking questions. If there was such a thing as an Obama shadow government, this is where it began. And where did his roots begin? Well, they can be traced back to Kenya. And how did he begin? Well, USAID can be traced back to Kenya after Somalia. Okay. And there's a lot of Chinese underground banking systems. We outed all of that aspect of it in the Bernie Sanders deep dive, okay, that these things actually exist. And we're doing the same thing here. All I'm doing is asking questions, okay? And I know this has been 30 minutes on this first question. Who instituted Every Child Succeeds Act? And there's so much to this because education is the linchpin of freedom or slavery. That's it. And when Lyndon B. Johnson instituted the Welfare Acts, they destroyed the colored people of this country. They were the colored people of this country, and it was the DNC that did it. It was the Democrats who did that. The most black people in this country at that time were Republicans. And they were enjoying a very wealthy, happy life. And part of all of that is why, all of that's wrapped up in why they assassinated JFK. And all of that's come out since all of that's been declassified. The DNC assassinated JFK. That's all out in the open now. You don't even have to question it anymore because it was declassified and people have already outed that. The DNC assassinated JFK via the CIA because he was too conservative. And this is exactly why the CIA and the U.S. military was in Somalia. They were propping up a government that was killing the conservative factions of Sunni Muslims. They were starving them to death. Supposedly, we were sending all this humanitarian aid into Somalia. However, at the same time we were sending all that quote-unquote aid, it was propping up a government that was literally starving all those people to death and murdering them in mass executions. Mass summary executions of the conservative factions of Muslims. And the pattern fits the exact same process of why they killed JFK. He was too conservative. He was too American. And that's when the Democrat Party changed. The Democrat Party changed, and you can just see it. Every time you see an old video of Lyndon B. Johnson laughing, it's mockery. It's pure mockery. It's pure evil. It's mockery of someone who's making fun of everybody else who doesn't understand that the Democratic Party took over. Something external took over the American Democratic Party back then. And they were no longer a party that was American any longer. Once they instituted the Welfare Act, it was to enslave Black Americans and what was a smaller proportion back then, Latin and Hispanic peoples, to the DNC plantation. And through all of those welfare acts, they began educating those communities into equity instead of equality. They began to teach them that whites were supreme, and it didn't come out that way back then, but the precursors of it existed back then. That's what all those welfare acts were. To put you on welfare, to literally make you less than they were. And who were the majority of all the Democrats? White. Liberals. They were liberal back then. They were communists back then. That's where it all began. That's where the whole movement began, is the hippie generation, bunch of liberal white people. Counterculture revolution of the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And it's ironic because America was going around the world fighting communism, but communism was doing a psyop and psychological war here domestically. And it's kind of like the Iran thing right now. We're over there in Iran but we imported Muslims by the millions, and now they have compounds and envisioning whole like micro cities that are 100% Muslim law on U.S. soil, where their laws are above the supreme law of the land, and where their laws can continue to deprive children born in America of the freedoms of America, and they have to stay enslaved to Muslim law. It's absolutely insane. Okay. That's what Vietnam was. That's what happened during Vietnam. We're over there in Vietnam fighting Hanoi, and they're importing it right here into California. They were importing it into California and the West Coast under the radar. Anyway, so also Obama was also responsible for Race to the Top. So there's 2 acts that Obama did in his first and second administration. Okay. Obama was also responsible for Race to the Top. So going back one step farther, now, Race to the Top was funding for education. But, so yes, and then, No Child Left Behind Act was replaced by Every Student Succeeds Act. But they had to they had to get a wedge in there first, right? And the wedge is always money, right? It's always aid. When they want change, they'll send aid. That's the pattern. That's how we do it internationally, and that's how Barack Obama did it here. So he was trained internationally and then immigrated to the United States, and then got educated at Harvard and was part of an op, and he still is. Obama was responsible for Race to the Top, AI, or was Obama, and I know he was because that's when I was matriculated to my advanced degrees and doctorate education and with provost and all that kind of stuff. So, and I was on, $1 million plus state grants for underperforming schools in rural counties, et cetera, et cetera. I have about the best experience in education in K-12 education without being in a K-12 education anybody could possibly have. I have it from the top down. I've seen it. I know what goes on. And not only that, but then I also taught for several years. And anyway. So I know what this stuff is, okay? Yes, President Barack was directly responsible for the Race to the Top initiative. He announced the program on, plus I built a grassroots nonprofit from nothing over 6 years to something very, very reputable and well liked by the whole region of the country at that time, and it was to help improve the educational outcomes of students. And some of these Race to the Top funds were used by the schools to support the programs. Anyway, he announced the program on July 24, 2009, alongside Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, calling it a signature effort to reform public education. Well, what did that mean? Now we can look back. Now that we see the product of it, it is 17 years later, almost 20 years later now, 2 decades of children have gone through the education, this reformed education. Well, what's the product? Well, we have BLM, we have DEI, we have Antifa, we had OPS, we had Operation Wall Street, OWS. I didn't mean OPS. OWS. We've had all these kind of things happen since this Race to the Top reform and ESSA. So this tells you exactly, and Tulsi Gabbard said he was the spearhead of it. And so that means every policy was designed to destroy America and to replace it with scientific socialism. That's exactly what it's being replaced with. That's what DEI, that's what equity, that's what social justice, that's what all these things, that's what the removal of barriers for people of color, that's what white supremacy, these are all Bolshevik language. This is Marxist, Lenin, socialist, Bolshevik language. And it's intended to destroy America. This is where it began, y'all. And we were so delusional at the time. We were caught unaware. It had already been designed. That's what Obama's actual education was. From childhood. From Kenya to Harvard to the pulpit in the White House of the dark god. And I'm not talking about his skin. I'm talking about his spirit, his spirituality. Unlike traditional education funding, Race to the Top was structured as a $4.35 billion competitive grant program. Instead of dividing money equally, the U.S. Department of Education awarded funds only to states that created the most robust plans to reform their schools. And that's exactly, so the state of Kentucky, that's exactly one of the state grants that I worked on in my master's degree. That was literally my graduate assistantship. That's what I was hired to do. It was do all the research to support the grant. It was $1.5 million grant to assist, I think it was 27 underperforming schools. And I had to do all the data calculations and everything. And I also had to do all of the research. So I had to read all the databases and everything. I had to pull all the correct research articles so that the professors who were heading the grant would be able to write what they needed to write. And instead of dividing money equally, this is what the grant was for. This is what the state received the funds for. This is what the state used the funds for. And we had 3 years to find out if the program worked or not. And at the end of 3 years, I don't remember the actual program that was instituted. Like, it was a set system, a set of published works, education publishers, and they had their whole system that we were implementing for this as part of the grant, and we had to evaluate whether over 3 years it worked or not. Well, the outcome was that it trended towards working. However, the first year was for training, and the second year was for implementation, and so then you only had 1 year to introduce it to students and obtain actual real data. And so what are you going to get out of that? Well, nothing, because all of the research showed that it takes 3 to 5 years of implementation to see an actual change. Well, if you only had 1 year, and I had to do the whole, I did the actual presentation of what the data stated and the published work, the publication that the two or three professors who were heading it actually wrote. So, you're not going to get the data that you want. And if in the first year it's trending towards showing a benefit, well, then by 2 and 3, you're going to see robust change of implementation. You know what was so striking about it was they canceled the grant. So all of these Race to the Top funds, and looking back on that experience now, I was in shock, because we were actually aiding these schools in improving, but the state didn't renew the grant after that. And a lot of the people over the state, at the state level, who were divvying out these funds and over receiving and giving up these funds for the grant, basically they stopped all of it after that time. Well, so then what was it really about? What were we really instituting, implementing into the schools? It was a Trojan horse. Now we can say clearly, looking back, that it was a Trojan horse. And they were actually, we're going to get to it in a minute. It's going to blow your mind. And please, I know I hope you don't get bored with this. It's big. It's a lot. And we are at 50 minutes right now. And I'm going to try to get down here to a couple more questions. But the next question that comes to mind is, well, where did all the LGBTQ trans stuff begin? Why is it so formalized now? It had to begin small somewhere. Well, where? And that's where I'm trying to say this Trojan horse began. It really wasn't about helping these black children and colored children in rural schools or inner city schools actually achieve higher standards. That was just the Trojan horse. And so anyway, and I'm saying that now, looking back at my experience on that grant, because there was no reason not to actually, if it was really intended to assist underperforming schools, well, we were trending towards better performance, and we had the data, we had the research background, we had all the evidence we needed to continue the grant, and to continue to show positive effects on students. But they didn't. Why waste then that means the 1.5 million was a waste. But except it wasn't. Except it wasn't, because it was only the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse brought the soldiers and the military in, which collapsed the country. Okay? And that's what's happening. That's what's happened. That's what happened then. Only we didn't know. We thought we were actually doing something very beneficial, right? And I'll tell you another thing that began were Confucius institutes all over the country. Chinese culture. All of a sudden, all this money began to flow into colleges and universities to host more Chinese professors, Chinese cultural infusion through Confucius Institutes. And there's another sister program, I think, that was the parent of that, I think. I don't know, but I was there with the provost when she was going back and forth to China. And I was there when they built and instituted the Confucius Institute. And we began to, as the university, actually but I was just a graduate student, so I can't say we. They began to institute all this sort of Chinese cultural influence. And this was happening all over the country. Well, it was very exciting, to be honest, and to help with that and to help her with that and be a graduate assistant as a part of that. It was fantastic. It was very exciting. And some of the things that happened on campus were extraordinarily beautiful. Okay. But then not only Chinese, but then Indian students were being brought in. And that's when H-1B, it's not when H-1B began and all visas began and everything, but they exploded during those years, during the Obama years. And now we know, all these years later, that it was used as another open borders system, style system. And I had lots of Indian friends. I was welcomed into their homes. I had a lot of, student peers that I was friends with who were Indian. I was invited to dinners with them, and this house I was invited to eat. This girl made dinner for me. She was an Indian girl, and it was very fortunate. Okay, and had no problem with it back then. I still have no problem with Indian people. They're very beautiful and amazing people, and very intelligent. And and their lifestyles are, second to none. The same with the Chinese. They have very high standards. They have very high standards for their children and for their lives to be successful. However, when you look back at Lyndon B. Johnson, there's a very dark and disturbing contrast to subject everybody to welfare, the majority to welfare and abortion. And it's very dark what happened, what Democrats did. And then Obama come along and they removed all the standards so that they would be passed no matter what, no matter even if they couldn't do it, no matter if they did any work. And this is why we now have so much of these teen takeovers and everything, because they are literally, they have no other cognitive capacity. And this is how, and I'm not saying they have the potential, just like every other person. There's no difference. Okay. There's no difference between how their brain works and how my brain works. How neuron. Now I know this from neuroscience, educational neuroscience. I know this. This is what my whole background was. And education was. There's no difference between how their neurons form templates and how our neurons, how mine as a white person form templates, or the Indian or the Chinese or the Native American. They're all the same. However, Democrats changed their environment via the welfare acts. And should people have access to welfare when they're in need? Sure, but not as a lifelong dependency, like a surrogate, like an umbilical cord. Because what happens is you create a whole class of people then who never get off of the tit. They just keep breastfeeding and breastfeeding and breastfeeding, and they don't have the cognitive function to do anything else. And so that's why you have all these teen takeovers now. It has devolved. What happened and what was instituted back then by Democrats to enslave Black America, and it's no longer Black America. Now it's Hispanics and Latinos too. While the Indians and the Chinese, the whites remain whites. They're trying to make it even more evil and call it white supremacy because the disparity is so huge. And it's not because of whites. Well, it is because of certain kind of whites. Liberals, Lenins, Marxists, hippies. Okay? People who are anti-Christian. Atheists who are scientific socialists. That's what embodies America today. That's what this left movement is. It's scientific socialism. It began in Somalia I'm not saying it began there, but that's where I can trace it back to. Its beginnings to. We propped up a government that was promoting scientific socialism to its populace so that it could go out and murder and be okay with murdering 150 to 200,000 conservative Sunnis. And those people were trained by communist Russia. Syed Bar, who Ilhan Omar's father worked for. He was trained by communist Russia before American forces came in under George W. Bush. This is very dark history. It's hard. It's disturbing. And then it came to America. The hippie generation and all of that kind of stuff, it was funded by foreign powers and by our own anti-American institutions in Washington, D.C. through USAID and programs like that. All right, so Race to the Top funds were Trojan horses to then create the building parts, the infrastructure, the concrete, the foundation, which then led to Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced Common Core. Common Core was actually, and I'm not, if you're against it, you can have your beliefs. But here's why Common Core was instituted. Because the Chinese and the Indians were, well, maybe not the Indians at that time, but the Chinese at that time were producing more honors students than the United States could produce all students. They were graduating every year more honor students than the United States had a total population of students. Now you think about that. How's that going to affect America's competitiveness and its status as world power, as the global leader, when China was graduating more honor students than we could graduate all students on a yearly basis? The whole population of students. So, and then India also began the same kind of statistical growth, okay, of explosion of students graduating with high-tech degrees. And America was not prepared. And so that's basically the impetus for instituting Common Core, so that students would have a foundation before they left K-12 with something that was competitive with the graduation rates of honor students in China and India, to remain competitive in the world. However, then Obama came along, and everything became all about the color of skin, specifically black skin. And they were the ones who caused the disparities between blacks and whites, their white counterparts, but also the Chinese and the Indians who were coming into this country, and also Russians and Armenians, and so many populations of communities around the world. And it was all because of the welfare acts of the Democrats and Lyndon B. Johnson that began the decline of the black community from being Republican, majority Republicans, and having equal stature and equal rights with the rest of the country. And so the whole point was to destroy. That's why JFK was killed, because the Democrats wanted to destroy the conservative side of the Democrat Party, exactly like they did in Somalia. Syed Barre and Ilhan Omar's father did. And that's who they brought in to reinforce the movement, to murder off all the and I'm not saying physically, I'm saying psychologically now. This is a psycho war, psyop. Right? If you can't see that by now, although murder has been part of it, Charlie Kirk, JFK, all the Republicans, all the white, Christian, national, American-loving, MAGA, America First people, they want to murder that in your mind so that you will become a puppet and lemming, useful idiot. That's what Lenin called people who followed him. Useful idiots. Isn't that ironic? Well, that's what they call you. That's what Democrats call you behind your back. That's why when you look at Lyndon B. Johnson and all the snickering and laughing and smiling that guy did, it was pure evil, because it was mockery, because he was the same. You're all just useful idiots to him back then. The whole black community who praised and worshipped and wanted welfare acts and all this kind of stuff, and as a form of reparations, by the way, and P.S. side note, to the black community for all they suffered. The dialogue is the words may have been different, the dialogue's the same. That's how all that got instituted. And you're begging for it again today. And it's just another Trojan horse, and it's not going to do anything to benefit you. It's going to destroy you. I taught on the Native American population, okay? I taught Native Americans in a classroom on the Navajo reservation. I loved it. I loved the people. I loved the area. I would go back in a heartbeat. The problem is they have casinos. And many of the tribes don't have to work because the casinos provide enough money for people to live off of, whole families and whole tribes to live off of free, because they just get these checks from the casinos. That's a form of reparations to Native Americans because of displacement by the colonists and the rise of America through the ages. Okay, so these casinos were allowed to happen to support them and to provide reparations for them. When people would drive through and go gamble at the casinos, well, that provided them a source of income. Okay, it's reparations. But what happened to those people? Well, you can look it up on YouTube. There's actual biographies, documentaries, biographies, whatever you want to call them, on YouTube of what's happened to some of those populations. I'm not saying to all of them, but I'm going to tell you right now, just from living there and being there, the statistics are real. And in all cases, it having a source of income that gives you a free life like that destroys whole tribes, increases crime, increases all kinds of abuses that's very disheartening. I had to deal with it. I had to deal with it in my classroom. It was heartbreaking. Okay. However, I'm not going to get off too deep in that, but that's the point of reparations. That's the point of welfare. And it wasn't white Republican Christian America that caused these disparities and they labeled it white supremacy. All of that is to enslave you more. The truth is that the majority of blacks were Republicans before welfare was instituted. And they were on equal constitutional footing and right after 14th Amendment was instituted. Okay? After Civil Rights Acts. You had the greatest freedom you've ever had. You had the greatest, stature and status that you ever had. And that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to go on because this is what Race to the Top was all about, and this is what ESSA was all about, was to change the education system into scientific socialism so that you would murder in your mind. And now they're going out in the streets. They're just stabbing the girl on the bus. It's happening. Stabbing the kid in the high school stands. It's happening everywhere. Attacking whites for no reason. Murdering children. Murdering people in restaurants, on the streets, in places of business, in their homes. Everywhere, all over this country, it's happening because they've been educated ever since ESSA and ever since Race to the Top to hate the conservative white America, the actual living America, and to murder it. That's what all of this brought in. And it came all the way over. It was imported from Somalia, via Russia, via China, from Syed Barre to Ilhan Omar's father, a colonel under that regime, supported by CIA, propped up by CIA. And they went around mass summary executions of conservative Sunni Muslims by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, and starved them to death. And that's exactly what they're trying to do to white America today. The gas prices, the inability to get loans, inability to get jobs. If your name sounds white, you're getting overlooked. You're being deselected by AI algorithms when you apply for jobs, because you do not have the same, you do not have the right last name. You don't have a foreign sounding colored last name. And I'm sorry, but that's the facts. This is the war on America today. This is what it has evolved into. It's why you can't get good loan rates. It's why you can't get the things that 10, 15 years ago seemed easy to have, easy to have access to. You know, they already brought it all out in lawsuits against Harvard and other universities who were selecting people based on race, non-white, and discriminating against white people. It's going on still. It's worse, actually, because you're not hearing about it as much. So, how states earned the funding. To win a portion of the Obama White House Archives Race to Stop funds, states were graded on a point system. Higher standards, adopting rigorous college-ready academic standards, which heavily encourage the adoption of Common Core. Teacher evaluations, creating performance-based. I'm going to tell you about this. This is what AI brought up because it's what's on the surface, but it's not the truth. It's not what was happening on the ground in the institutions. I'm going to tell you the exact opposite is what's happening. All of this had to be part, to get passed and to get the funding available, all of this language had to be part of the bills on the surface. Because nobody in America is going to support a bill that says, well, you're no longer going to be able to write students up if they're black, if they're colored. You're no longer going to be able to punish them. I mean, look at what's going on in the courts today. Criminals are not being punished in the courts today because why? Well, because there's a disparity, because there's so many. And I dealt with it. I worked in a school that this exact same thing was going on. They had their policies, they had all the written stuff and everything, but if you followed it, you were going to get reprimanded. Because the exact opposites are true. And your evaluation is based on not what you followed as the policy of the school, but what you followed as the unspoken, unwritten, which is don't punish them if they're colored, if they're black or Hispanic, if they're a non-white race. Because if you do, you as the teacher are going to get written up as you don't have good classroom management skills. And you're going to get put on a intervention plan. You see how that ruins your reputation? Data tracking, build better data systems to track students. And they did build better data systems, right? That's what Harvard was using. That's what California universities were using. That's what all these universities across the country were using to discriminate against white students. And you don't have to take, these are lawsuits that happened in the Supreme Court within the past 10 years. Well, why did they begin doing that? Well, because these data systems, build better data systems to track student. Well, they use the same kind of the better data systems to implement the 2020 election fraud through Dominion and systematic or whatever that system was. Okay. This is the Trojan horse, y'all. This is where it began. All of it began. Failing schools, implementing aggressive interventions to completely turn around the lowest performing schools. Well, that's exactly what I said. Those race to the top funds were what the state used. And in the grant that I literally worked on a grant that's connected to this. And that's even though the data said, well, we are turning the school around, they ended it after 3 years. Just waste $1.5 million down the tubes for nothing. All the time, energy. You had to train teachers. You had to train interventionists. You had to do all this stuff. Waste of time, money, resources, because it wasn't followed up. It was just cut off. Oh yeah, ARRA as well. Okay, ARRA funds. It was carved out of American recovery and recovery for who? And reinvestment into what? I'm telling you, all of that is race-based language. All of that was race intended. Reinvested into what? Into the scientific socialist takeover of the United States. Recovery from what? An engineered financial crisis? You know, it's just sad. It's sad. It's hurtful to do these deep dives and to have an understanding, now looking back. All of it from Obama forward has to be trashed. All of it has to be trashed or it's going to destroy America. And we have to turn and rend it. We have to put the axe to the root of it. Many people have to be taken down and taken out because of it. Because they are complicit, because they are knowing accessories after the fact, because they partnered, aided, and abetted the attempted overthrow of the United States of America. It didn't happen with Biden. Now, Biden was definitely 2.0 of it, but it all started back here. This is where all the money and the infrastructure began. The open borders thing was just the roof on the house. It was just the military invasion, the bodies. All of this other stuff was the infrastructure they needed first. The economic stimulus package passed during the Great Recession. So anyway, yeah. According to policy analysts at Education Next, this strategy allowed the administration to successfully bypass gridlock in Congress. Look at that. So people were fighting for your freedom, and they bypassed it. And spur rapid policy changes in state legislatures across the country. And those policy changes were the gerrymandering, were the election rules, and all of those kind of topics that have led to where we're at today. And what's happening in the Supreme Court, it's filtered up to the Supreme Court now today. And the Supreme Court's overturning it. They got to get that birthright citizen right. They got to get the birthright citizenship right. And this is why John Thune and others will not pass the Save America Act. He's aligned with the Democrats, and they are the legislative body of scientific socialism in America. They are the actual enemy in Congress in America. They're the enemy. And they have to start being treated as that. Like today, not tomorrow, not after the next election, not wait for what happens tomorrow. Hail, H-A-I-L, hail, no. We have to squash it today. Today. Enough is enough. And our leaders have to grow a spine, and they have to start squashing the ants that have invaded, and the cockroaches and all the pests that have invaded, the rodents that have invaded America. And you have to start there in Congress, because they're aiding and abetting it. The actual overthrow and destruction of America is treason, it's sedition, it's insurrection. You know, the J6 thing is such a comedy because, yeah, you're right, it was an insurrection against the scientific socialism assault on America. That's what it was against. We were fighting for our country against the takeover. Everybody knew that the election was a fraud. Everybody knew it. And then they had to go through all this show and this it was all the Land of Oz. Go watch Wizard of Oz, because that's exactly what happened. And the Wicked Witch of the West, Nancy Pelosi. Chuck Schumer. The dude, the little fat guy pulling the curtain. Nader, Ralph Nader. You know, there's a whole cabal of them. Okay? And it was all fake. The Emerald City is all fake. But that's what they promote, right? It's all going to be streets of gold, right? It's all a lie. User. Okay, so I asked the next question. Of course, I asked this next question. Well, you know, was it really a Trojan horse? Now, you got to, again, you have to take okay, I'm going to pause right here because that's 1 hour and a half. We're going to pause right here, and we're going to get to this next question in the next video.
You've been listening to the Coalmine Canary. The canary has left the building. I repeat, the canary has left the building.